Hello, I'm Dr. Rafael Gutierrez again, the author of Breaking Points, which is a book on how iken hiatsu can be determined in a kata by using clinical data, and also the author of Cirrus and the Rarest Things, which is pretty much just it's a story based on my time in Okinawa, slightly fictionalized. Now, while I have done a lot of these videos before, I'm actually starting to get questions, which is really cool, because this way I can see what other people would like to really know and get answered in a more clinical setting. But the one I'm actually going to talk about is pretty important, pretty neat, because I was actually seeing it in two areas. One is televisions. I was watching Jessica Jones on Marvel's Superhero, which is on Netflix, which I did enjoy, but she ended up doing something that you see in a lot of movies. Someone grabs a head or neck and just with a little twist or turn breaks a neck. The other reason I'm actually doing this is I ran into an ex-student of mine who had been a Marine before he was in my class and had told me a story of a civilian contractor who taught them unarmed fighting techniques, where he taught to grab the shoulder and pull the head, just like you see in these movies. And what I was talking, when he mentioned this, is I was talking about the amount of forces that are needed to break the neck. And it's a lot of force. One of the main studies that was done on how to execute prisoners humanely back in the 1800s, I can't remember, but they found that you needed someone to fall a certain amount of space, time to develop enough force to do this. And the amount of force ended up being equal to about 1,500 newtons. For those of you who don't know what a newton is equal to kilogram meter per second squared. Meaning that if you take a kilogram, which is 2.3 pounds roughly, it's moving a meter in 1 second. That's the amount of force that we're actually dealing with. It may not sound like much until you start realizing that we're talking about 1,000 of those. So when I started telling him the forces, he says, well, why are they teaching me this? And I always wondered, why would they teach something that doesn't work? And the only thing I could think of is many people use movies and lore to determine what works. And there is some lore that may be appropriate, that may actually work, but a lot of it seems to be off. Now, I always mention these, I like to mention these movies where they use martial arts and stuff, because usually the martial arts are fake. The people and these companies that are making these movies don't really get the right clinical director, right person to actually do damage to see if certain moves can be done. I'm hoping that if someday they make a really good martial art movie, they will get someone who knows what they're talking about. But so that is actually some of the reasons that I did come out with this. Now, when we're dealing with neck fractures, we can't just say, well, this happens or this doesn't happen, and just do mathematical modeling, because there are certain things that have happened. They actually have done some experiments on how much it takes to break the neck, and they did some cadaver studies where they found that about 300 newtons of force was enough to break the neck on a cadaver. Ironically, when it's a live human being, we start getting numbers in the thousands. So it may not just be the bone that you need to break. It may be the muscle that you need to actually get to move. First, I'm going to tell you the main ways people break their neck. The first one is hyperflexion. Flexion of the head is bringing it down this way. So hyperflexion is you really come down this way, and you tend to break parts of the neck there. The way people get this fracture is usually from diving into shallow water. So you dive, you come down head first, all your weight goes into your neck, and it snaps. Think of how much force that is there. The other one that we have is usually seen in car accidents. And that is someone's driving, they get in a car accident, their head continues forward, they hit the dashboard, and they extend their neck to a point where they break bones in the cervical region. The other one we see usually we see it in car accidents, but it can also be seen in American football, where you have two really strong, really heavy, really fast men run against each other. One puts his head down and spears the other one, and it causes a compression fraction of the cervical vertebrae. The other two that are relatively common, one is called the fracture of the occipital condyles. Now, the occipital bone is a bone in the back of the skull, and it has two rounded projections that do touch the cervical vertebrae. When we were dealing with neck fractures, I looked at all the data, and what I found is you only had a incidence of 0.4% of all neck fractures being condylar fractures of the occipital bone. So we're dealing with, you take every fracture of the neck, 0.4%, 0.4% will be condylar fracture. And the reason I stress this is because I've seen in a lot of martial art forums, people talk about condylar fracture and how you can break it just by slapping someone in the head a certain way. Again, the forces that you're dealing with are too strong for you to actually just develop with one hand. Or even with your entire body. You're talking about 1,000 newtons of force. Now, the other one that is a little more common is called a Hangmans Fracture. Now, Hangmans Fracture is named because once upon a time the English were trying to find a way to humanely execute prisoners, and they found that if a body falls a certain distance, it causes the dens of the second cervical vertebrae, the axis, to fracture, and the dens comes off, cutting the spinal cord, and person pretty much dies relatively quickly. Again, we had a huge drop, and we needed, as I mentioned, almost 1,500 newtons of force. So we're dealing with a lot of force when it comes to the neck. But one of the things I would tell you is, don't just look at this. Look at also sports. Now, in MMA, we have seen some fractures of the neck. Usually they've occurred when someone lifts someone and drops them on the head, and they don't protect their head. They don't try to tuck it in a certain way, or maybe they tucked and they actually got hit in the top of the head instead of the neck, instead of the back, and so they can end up breaking the neck with these throws. I have read a couple which talked about minor fractures using a guillotine as you fall backwards can sometimes break, but it was actually not as bad as the being dropped on the head. And again, you're dealing with, if you think about it, if you're dealing with a 200-pound man and a 200-pound man, that's 400 pounds falling against the cervical bone with the head tucked in. So it would be the same type of fracture as the hyperflexion, just in a slightly different mechanism. So we're talking about mass power you cannot produce to your hands. So this whole idea that you're going to break this neck by coming like this is ridiculous, and it's kind of insulting if anyone's teaching you this. Well, I hope this makes sense to you, and if not, please send me questions. I will answer them. There's a couple other questions that I'm going to be going over, and one of them is actually about the knee and the foot when you rotate, if there's a better way to do one versus the other. And I'm hoping that that's something that will interest you guys. If you're one of the people who is viewing this and are thinking, well, this is interesting, but I would really want to see how X works in a more anatomical, physiological sense, please, in the comments, put that you want me to cover something, and we'll get to it, if sooner rather than later, I hope. And I am trying to cover systems. So right now, if you notice, I'm mostly talking about skeletal areas. Eventually, I will talk about bones, besides bones, muscles, and all that. So I hope you enjoyed this, and if you did and think you got something out of it, let me know. If not, you can let me know too. Probably will ask you why you didn't get anything. Thank you, and good night.